Hey there, everyone. This is WinksThinks. I'm your host, Sean Winkler, and welcome to episode 3. Now, for today, I wanted to take you on a little adventure through the realm of philosophy of the not so distant past, namely philosophy from 20th century France. To do this, I'm going to provide a brief introduction to the thought of two of this period's most prominent representatives, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. Now, who exactly were Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari? Well, Deleuze was a 20th century philosopher who was a professor at University of Paris 8, Vincennes, for the better part of his career. He wrote several monographs on major figures in the history of philosophy, and he presents his own system in Difference and Repetition, The Logic of Sense, as well as a published lecture entitled The Method of Dramatization. His thought is characterized not only by an engagement with philosophy, but art, film, literature, mathematics, psychoanalysis, and even the natural sciences. Guattari was also a 20th century philosopher, but he wasn't only a philosopher. He was also an experimental psychiatrist. He worked for his entire career at the Laborde Clinic located near Cour-Cheverny in Loire Valley in France. The clinic was unique in that it adopted a democratic and anti-bureaucratic approach to therapy, which allowed patients to play roles in its actual functioning through a system of rotating division of labor. If you're interested in learning more about Laborde, I'd recommend a documentary entitled La Moindre des Choses, which means Every Little Thing in French, by Nicolas Philbert, which shows the clinic's annual tradition of putting on a stage play in the summertime. Among Guattari's major works are The Machinic Unconscious, Schizoanalytic Cartographies, The Three Ecologies, Chaosmosis, Psychoanalysis and Transversality, Chaosophy, and Soft Subversions. Together, Deleuze and Guattari wrote 4 books, Anti-Oedipus, Kafka, A Thousand Plateaus, and What is Philosophy, although Deleuze is said to have mainly written the latter text on his own. They also wrote a handful of shorter works together, which include On the Line, Nomadology, and a published interview entitled Capitalism, A Very Special Delirium. Now, before we get started, I should note that even though I'll be discussing a way into understanding the work of both Deleuze and Guattari, I'll primarily be relying on my background knowledge of Deleuze, only because it's his work that I'm more familiar with. Perhaps in a future episode, I can talk about it a little bit more from the perspective of Guattari's background, but we'll do it this way for now. So, over the course of the podcast, I'm going to try and proceed in the course of 3 steps. First, I want to explain why I'm talking about Deleuze and Guattari in the first place. Second, I'll give you some background on the ideas that they're responding to from 3 perspectives. The first is the thought of Martin Heidegger, the second through psychoanalysis, and the third through Marxism. Then in the third section of the podcast, I'm going to give a little introduction to what I see as being the best way into their thinking, which is the title of this episode, and that's the concept of the rhizome. So first part, why did I want to focus on these 2 thinkers in particular? Well, many philosophers from post-Second World War continental European philosophy, particularly this period of French philosophy, are notoriously very difficult to read because they use highly experimental style and terminology. Now, there's plenty of room to attribute this to pretense, but one can't ignore the fact that this approach was adopted as a way of breaking from academic convention at the time. And if you sit with these texts long enough, the struggle to get acclimated to this terminology bears a very rich payoff. Now, Deleuze and Guattari are one of the most notorious examples of engaging in this style of very abstruse writing. They present their theses in a sometimes scattershot fashion, and this can give the reader the sense of being just thrown into the middle of something without any orientation whatsoever. Their style is also very free associative. It's almost hallucinatory in character, as they migrate from topic to topic at an almost frenzied pace. They also employ countless neologisms, which they never come out and define, and you have to get the sense of their meaning through how they are used throughout the course of the text. If that weren't enough, they utilize a dizzying array of references, which they rarely summarize, requiring the reader to consult outside sources to begin to even understand what it is they're talking about in certain circumstances. So this combination of presentation, style, terminology, and highly referential nature typically elicits a very frustrated reaction in the reader. But if you look at some of Deleuze's earlier texts on the history of philosophy, while these texts are very difficult, they're written in a rather clear academic style, and it shows that he clearly has a very strong command of the tradition. And this doesn't automatically have to mean that his collaborative works with Guattari have to be taken seriously, but I want to suggest that it means that their style is not a cover for a lack of depth, but rather is something of a more performative nature. If they throw you into the middle of their project, it's because they're struggling to convey a new way of thinking. But not only that, if they're throwing you into the middle of something, it's because this is a part of their actual project. Now, does this performative dimension of their project always succeed? Well, not always. But if you're willing to sift through these massive and sometimes quite rambling works, you'll find some extraordinary insights, many of which are even quite profound. So the reason I wanted to talk about these two for this episode was to find a way of navigating through the very rich but chaotic worldview presented by these two thinkers. And as I mentioned, I want to do this through their concept of the rhizome, a subject presented in the introduction, itself entitled Rhizome, to their third major collaboration, A Thousand Plateaus. And before we get to that, let's provide some context. So for the second part here, let's talk about Deleuze and Guattari's theoretical background to see what their project is actually responding to. As I just mentioned, they themselves often just toss off references left and right, so it'd be helpful to get some sense of where their thought actually fits in. Now, as I mentioned before, I'll primarily be doing this through Deleuze. This podcast would go on for days if I tried to introduce all of Deleuze's references. So I'm going to stick to one philosopher and two larger schools of thought that I find are most important for the point that I want to make today. So the thinker is Martin Heidegger, and the schools of thought are psychoanalysis and Marxism. Now, Martin Heidegger was a 20th century German philosopher who was and remains to this day highly influential. According to Heidegger, the theme of philosophy has been the question of being, and since the time of Plato and Aristotle, philosophy has asked various questions that terminate into one ultimate question: what is being? For Heidegger, however, philosophy hasn't succeeded in answering this question because the question itself has been improperly posed since the time after the pre-Socratics. You'll notice in the redundancy of the question itself, which is effectively no different than what is what is. Philosophers have continually tried to explain being by resorting to some original or absolute being. So to provide an example, by trying to explain the origin of the physical universe, if one were to explain it by God as a first cause, they would be explaining it through a causal relation. But they wouldn't be making a dent in addressing the question of being as such, as it explains one being by a more superior or more powerful being. So because philosophers since the time of Plato and Aristotle haven't posed the right question, the history of Western metaphysics has really been a history of forgetting the meaning of being altogether. The being of the question is the sign of that forgetting. So for philosophy to break from metaphysics and begin anew requires deconstructing the history of that forgetting of being. To begin understanding it also entails rethinking the nature of thought. As Heidegger famously says, we have not yet really been thinking. Now, Heidegger initiates a particular style of posing questions that becomes common throughout 20th century philosophy. Deleuze employs that strategy in his own way by saying that we have not only forgotten the question of being, but we've always assumed that being is singular. We have always conceived multiplicity in terms of unity, terms as superior to their relations. So taking Heidegger's insight one step, or multiple steps further, Deleuze seeks to find ways of thinking being as multiple. And of course, now you're probably asking, what does thinking of multiplicity have to do with anything? Well, let's see how it fits into the strategy of A Thousand Plateaus. It would help to know that A Thousand Plateaus is actually the second of a two-volume collaboration by Deleuze and Guattari called Capitalism and Schizophrenia, Anti-Oedipus being Volume 1. The volumes are, in part, addressed to what I mentioned before, psychoanalysis and Marxism, by virtue of there being ways that claim to surpass metaphysical ways of thinking and being, but which were unable to do so. Marxism, by its inability to surpass capitalism, and psychoanalysis in its inability to understand schizophrenia. Psychoanalysis, in positing the Oedipus complex, and Marxism, in positing the base superstructure model, claim to have moved beyond philosophy as metaphysics by pinpointing the principal basis on which societies reproduce themselves. The Oedipus complex, introduced in Freud's The Ego and the Id, refers to the conflict within the familial unit, that through the simultaneous desire to reproduce parental affection, while also confronted with an incest taboo, forces a child out of the familial unit to reproduce with one of a non-blood relation. And the Oedipus complex might sound strange today, but I think the insight remains relevant as an effort to explain the pressures of heteronormative expectations on father, mother, and child as the behavioral standard not only of psychosexual, but of social development as well. Now, the base superstructure model, introduced in Marx's preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy, refers to Marx's claim that no society exists without means and relations of production, the tools and techniques to produce goods for consumption, and the social relations upon which that production takes place. The social relations function as the motor of history through producing class conflict, that Marx posited would one day culminate in the end of history and a classless society. In detecting the motor of reproduction, psychoanalysis sought to at least alleviate psychological suffering, and Marxism sought to revolutionize society. In both cases, however, according to Deleuze and Guattari, rather than overcome oppressive structures, psychoanalysis and Marxism were either complicit in reproducing what they critiqued, or they created new forms of oppression altogether. This is because they were exceeded by the reality of the very things that they were designed to confront. Schizophrenia and capitalism are ways of thinking and being that are by nature multiple, realities which neither, respectively, psychoanalysis nor Marxism were equipped to confront. Contrary to the Oedipus complex, the schizophrenic unconscious doesn't possess stable signifiers, but constantly produces signs and identities that migrate from one meaning to the next. And contrary to Marxism, under capitalism, the economic base is not the only source of production in society. Rather, capital renders all of reality an unceasing factory of production, such that there is no actual center. Now, it should be noted that Deleuze and Guattari see neither capitalism nor schizophrenia as desirable, but is nevertheless revealing particular truths about not only their reality, but reality as such that, unless confronted, will not allow either to be surpassed. If at all possible, I think this is at least one way to summarize what Deleuze and Guattari were trying to accomplish in their capitalism and schizophrenia enterprise. So with that, let's get into the third part of the podcast and delve into our discussion of the introduction to 1,000 Plateaus, Rhizome. As you'll see very quickly, this is no ordinary introduction. Of course, on one hand, this introduction does serve the usual function of providing the reader with a kind of key to reading the remainder of the text. On the other hand, however, with the point that they're trying to make, they deconstruct the very notion, not only of an introduction, but of the book itself. Now, this strategy is meant to disorient your understanding of what it is that you're actually doing when you sit down to read a text, and in deconstructing this activity, they provide a window into their philosophical project. Now, just to give a little mini breakdown of this section, I'm going to talk about the three different models that they posit of books. First is the root book, the radical system, radical being R-A-D-I-C-L-E, or fascicular book, and then what they introduce as the superior model of the text, which is the rhizomatic model. What you'll see is that they're trying to use the rhizome not only as a particular conception of the book, but as a conception of reproduction and generation of forms in nature as a whole. So, let's begin. They start out by saying that we mostly approach books with the assumption that the book itself is structured in one of two ways, both models being expressible by way of analogy to the structure of a particular kind of plant life. The first kind is the root book, through which a book is analogous to something like a tree. Now, just as a tree starts from a single seed and is united through a single trunk, it grows vertically with its roots extending into the soil and branches extending skyward, so too, the guiding thread of a book, the plot, the theme, etc., bring unity to the various topics, characters, plot devices, and other elements, depending on what type of book it is, all together. Now, most books they maintain are structured in this manner. The second kind of book is that of the radical system or the fascicular root. Now, to be honest, I don't quite understand what they see in radical systems, but I do see what they mean by the fascicular root. Fascicles refer to plants where the leaves or needles of a plant grow in bunches, where several leaves or needles extend from the same node. Now, no leaf or needle is primary, and while they may appear from the outside to be separate, they are traceable back to the same point on the plant. As examples of this kind of book, they refer to those of William S. Burroughs, particularly those that he composed using the cut-up method, those of James Joyce, and those of Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, like the fascicular root, these kinds of books only appear fragmented and separable, but are ultimately traceable back to a hidden unity. Burroughs' cut-up method, for instance, was designed to bring unity to different fragments of texts. Joyce's Finnegan's Wake is an odyssey through the stream of consciousness, but ultimately it ends by connecting back to the very beginning of the text. Nietzsche, of course, speaks in aphorisms that are often very chaotic, but nevertheless he posits a kind of unity through his concept of the eternal return. Both kinds of texts are written and read with the assumption that the truth of the text is grounded in their unity. Unity within the structure of the text, unity of the author's intentions with what's on the page, and what is depicted, whether it be fictional or non-fictional, etc. But Deleuze and Guattari undermine the notion of a unified text by making an interesting argument. Namely, they say that the writing process is never actually complete, and that in fact, there's less of a difference between writing and reading than you might think. So they point out to the fact that when a writer sits down to produce a text, he or she doesn't start out with a fully formed idea in their heads, which they simply translate into written form. Ideas actually appear as intuitions of a fragmentary nature, and they are often not actually translatable into writing, but must become something else altogether when they are expressed in the written form. The process is in and of itself experimental and fragmented. And when the writer is satisfied, they may get the impression that the completed text was what they were trying to say all along. But the text remains populated by these contingent, fragmented moments that could have at any point headed in some other direction. That these fragments remain, Deleuze and Guattari maintain, are clear in the process of reading, where the reader picks up a fragment here and there and turns these fragments into something of his or her own. This not only affects the reader, but shows how the life of the book was never actually over to begin with, but is continually being reproduced and regenerated. That is why Deleuze and Guattari say, quote, "There is no difference between what a book talks about and how it is made. Therefore, a book also has no object." End quote. The jagged edges of the writing process may appear to be smoothed out on the surface, but they never actually cease to exist. And that is why they claim, quote, "A book exists only through the outside and on the outside. A book itself is a little machine." Now, the relationship of a reader to the text, they explain, is closer to what they describe as that between the wasp and the orchid. Now, this is going to sound pretty strange, but hang in there. One particular subspecies of orchid releases a chemical that attracts a wasp and gets the wasp to try to mate with it. The wasp, of course, eventually gets frustrated and flies off, but not before it's accumulated the pollen from the orchid on its body, which as it goes about its life can potentially spread and pollinate the ovules of another plant and reproduce other orchids. Deleuze and Guattari describe how in this process, the orchid doesn't simply mimic the wasp, just as the wasp doesn't simply mimic the orchid. They undergo a process where each is transformed through the encounter. It's through what they call a becoming. Now, what kind of root structure, you might ask, underlies this process? Their answer, a rhizome. Now, what exactly is a rhizome? Now, the word comes from the ancient Greek rhizoma, which means mass of roots. While the roots of many, if not most plants, trees, etc., grow vertically, reaching down into the earth as a plant grows upward. But a rhizome grows horizontally. The rhizome can generate grass, blossoms, bulbs, etc., which can grow upwards or downwards, but the productive and reproductive process of the rhizome itself stays strictly in a horizontal dimension. Some examples of plants that grow through a rhizomatic structure are, as I mentioned, the orchid, but also turmeric, potatoes, strawberries, lilies, asparagus, hops, bamboo, the Venus flytrap, certain types of grass and weeds, etc. Also, unlike most plants, if you separate a part of a rhizome and replant it, it will continue to grow. This makes any part of the rhizome as good as the other. Each part contains the entire code to produce and reproduce itself. Deleuze and Guattari believe it possible to take this biological notion and translate it not only into a conception of the book, but a philosophical concept which models the very nature of production and reproduction of forms in being itself. So they go on to outline 6 features of the rhizome that make it a suitable candidate for being this kind of philosophical concept. But I'm going to kind of restrict it to 3 that I see myself and that I think are a little bit clearer. The first thing they see is that within the rhizome itself, there's no distinction between the genesis and the structure. As I indicated above, every part of the rhizome contains the information to reproduce itself. Cause and effect coincide within the rhizome, meaning that it captures Deleuze and Guattari's sense of thinking through the notion of being as a process. Second, a rhizome is not a unity, but a multiplicity. Whereas a tree, for instance, is singular, if you chop down the trunk, it dies, a rhizome has no center, no unifying principle, and as indicated above, if you chop it up, it reproduces in another place. This allows them for a way of thinking multiplicity not simply as a sum of singular entities, but as a way of thinking multiplicity as prior to singularity. Third, the rhizome produces a model for showing how we come to perceive reality in reverse, why we take unity to be primary over multiplicity, form and structure over process. Remember that the rhizome can generate flowers, bulbs, grass, etc., and this is what we see above the surface. but burrowing through the soil not only of Earth, but of reality itself at the subterranean level is rhizomatic production. So, coming back to the book, just as the wasp and the orchid engage in a becoming that is traceable to the orchid's rhizomatic structure, when we really understand what happens in encounter with the text, we can trace it back to this rhizomatic dimension. For Deleuze and Guattari, the rhizome functions as a kind of hypothesis with which they'll try to experiment across the 500 or 600 or so pages of their book. And what they're ultimately asking is what happens if we try to explain structures in politics, in animal behavior, geology, sexuality, the human body, film, literature, etc., is all rooted in this rhizomatic model. And their ultimate goal is to trace the source of what they see as being oppressive power structures, to understand them along the lines of their rhizomatic model and find new ways of challenging them. Now, whether it's an effective model for doing so, we'll have to leave for another time. Of course, if Deleuze and Guattari are right, all I've been presenting to you today is the way my own way of thinking and being combines with their text. It's up to you to connect into their machine and see what your interaction with it produces. But I do think the example of the rhizome shows us a way to begin, or at least, according to their terms, a way of starting in the middle. And with that, I'll bring episode 3 to a close. You've been listening to WinksThinks. Thanks everyone for joining me, and I hope to see you next time.